you know, there's that whole narrative out there, and I'm sure you've heard it, Jose, which is like, oh, if we just stop talking about it, then it'll go away, right?
Right.
I mean, there's so much counter evidence to that, all around us that I don't know how anyone could possibly believe it, but that narrative is so strong out there, so prevalent.
Yeah. Yeah, that whole what is it, ostrich, stick your head in the sand kind of thing. That's not going to work, but I don't know if more conversations necessarily are going to work either. I don't know what the answer is, to be honest with you. Because like I said, like, there have been conversations happening around this topic my entire life, and it did seem for a while that things were getting better. And all of a sudden, around 2016, um, somebody made it allowable again for people to be openly racist. And it just kind of opened this floodgate that I was like, oh my God, people are still not just believing these things, but like passionately about it. And, I'd really kind of thought that we were making headway. And now it's, all these things are still there. Like they were still just kind of simmering underneath the surface. Well, I don't know if it's conversations that need to happen not just on a personal level, but on a global or a national level. I'm not sure.
Well, let me
Yeah, I'm not sure
give
what
you
the answer is.
my spiel about that, all
Yes,
right? And
please.
then you can tell me what you think about it. So, I don't think that conversation is an end unto itself, right? Conversation isn't some silver bullet that's going to solve racism whatsoever, okay? But I also don't think necessarily it makes sense to think of racism as something we can solve permanently in general, right? In group and out group bias is a thing that comes and goes, and race isn't the only category or context in which we deal with these biases, right?
Right.
Genders are stereotyped. People are stereotyped based on sexuality, based on hair color, based on ethnicity, right? Based on all kinds of things, culture, based on music they listen to, like, I mean, people are geography, people are based stereotype based on all kinds of things. So rather than thinking that conversation is some kind of ointment that's going to, heal the wound so that you never knew it was there in the first place or something, I think that what we need to think of it as is a first step toward a permanent institution of values that are anti-racist. Okay. And that is what we are lacking, I think, as at least definitely as a society in North America and many other continents around the world. But I focus mostly on America. And I think that here in America, we need to enshrine anti racism as one of our values. Not necessarily into law or anything like that per se, although I wouldn't mind that at all. We've definitely enshrined racism into law, so why not anti-racism?
Yeah.
So I think that conversation is the way we start getting there, because in order to get there, we have to open people's hearts up to the idea that this is a good thing for the country and that it's in line with the values that we already hold so dear of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all individuals. I think that that is the piece that is missing, the connection between those enlightenment values, as people like to say, and anti-racism as a value. And so that's part of the reason why I created this, is to draw those connections to be for people, because there really is nowhere in our society here in America where those connections are drawn for people. We don't do it institutionally in the public education system, and now it's against the law in many states to do so. We don't do it in our religious places of worship. Typically, for most places of religious worship in the United States, in fact, quite the opposite. Those places of worship have often preached racism and white supremacy from the pulpit, and they still do.
Right. Yeah.
And we don't really have many community spaces where that is considered an acceptable thing to do. And we don't have a lot of communities in general whereby their anti-racism is a part of that community, or at least nothing that would actually lead to development of values that would then be reflected in the community. So there's really no way for us to actually develop the kind of society that I believe we need to develop without at least starting by having a conversation, opening people's hearts to the idea that those conversations, excuse me, opening their hearts up to the idea that the value of anti-racism is a worthwhile value to have, even within a society that will shun you for having it.
Right.
And from there, once we have, a critical number of people who are on board with that, that's when actions can start being taken. But before that, any action that people take is going to be met with staunch resistance, even from people who would be an ally if their hearts were open first. Right. So that's what we're up against.
And do you think that part of that is because a lot of the conversation might seem to be a little preachy, um, with the purpose of being anti-racist, that it always seems to first be attached with acknowledging racism, which kind of seems like that's triggering for some people because it makes them feel like, well, they do have to accept their place in the system and what they may or may not have done to kind of maintain or uphold, or where they, is it acknowledgement of where they fit into the system that might be the biggest hurdle?
I think, in a way, yes. Okay. But I'd like to phrase it differently. So let's think about your friend's father, right?
Yeah.
So your friend's father had built up a value system that for him was real, reliable, and accurate, which was that indigenous peoples, brown people, were, dirty, were stinky, were smelly, were less than, and inferior in some way, such that he didn't even want his son to be around them. And he was acting out that value system by saying, don't invite them to your birthday party. I'm not going to have them in my house. I don't want them in my community. I'm sure he did it in other ways, right? So,
Right.
in order for him to accept anti racism as a value, he would have to reflect on himself, right? And the things that he did and realize that those things were him acting out racism. And I think that is what people are not willing to do, right? Because they don't have to. There's really no reason for him to do that unless he wants to, except for self improvement, right? Like you have to develop an inner will, if you will, desire to want to be better, to want to change, to want to open your heart up to other people. So without that inner desire, without that inner will, there's literally no other catalyst to make such a thing happen. And so I think that is the barrier. That's why I said there's really no place for this kind of thing to occur. That's by design. We don't
Right.
create an environment where that is an outcome, opening one's heart to others, reflecting on one's past bad acts and deciding to be better and change. You'll actually get punished for doing that in the race context. Okay. Like I've talked to many people who were kicked out of their churches for promoting anti-racism with the congregation, being like, hey, maybe we should think about doing something about this. And then they get shunned, they get excommunicated, they lose all their friends, they lose all, they lose a whole community just because of that and for no other reason. Thanks for watching. For access to the full-length conversation and all of the 2-hour long unedited conversations that I've had on race, click the support link in the description below. Thanks for your support and see you next time.